Bonjour à tout le monde. Je vais faire la conférence en anglais, so I'm going to do it in English, but I'm more than happy to answer questions in French or in English. So thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. So my name is Amélie Barras. I'm a professor at Toronto at York University in a law and society program there. And I'm trying to make this work. Comme ça. Voilà, parfait. And I'm also the graduate program director there of their Socio-Legal Program. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself, and then I'll dive in the project and the book I'm going to speak to you about today. So my work for the past 15 years has been at the intersection of religion, law, and politics. And I've been really interested in thinking about the politics of secularism. So I'm trained as a political scientist. I did my PhD at the London School of Economics, but then I did a postdoctoral research in Montreal in religious studies. And I'm now working in a socio-legal program. So actually my work is deeply interdisciplinary, and the book that I'm going to speak to you about today reflects, I think, this interdisciplinarity. So I'm going to talk to you about my new book called Faith and Rights, Christian-Inspired NGO at Work in the United Nations. It came out with Stanford University Press in the fall of last year. And it's a project that was funded by the Social Science Research Council of Canada. And the book explores the human rights practice of some Christian NGOs at the Human Rights Council. And there's actually very little research on human rights NGOs at the Human Rights Council. So that's one of the key interests of the book. Okay, but before I speak to you about that, this is the structure of the talk for today. So I will just start by presenting the genesis of the work, so why I came up and why I thought about doing that project. Then I'll speak about the methods. I think this is actually really important because if we want to speak and understand the practice of work of NGOs, we need methods here are key. I'll share some findings and then maybe some key takeaways, and then we can open up for discussions. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book. I think like many projects we embark on, they build on each other. And so this project is part of that. So it's really one of the reasons why I embarked on it is related to the previous work I had done. So in a previous work, in a book I published in 2014, I had worked called Refashioning Secularism in France and Turkey. I had worked on secularism in France and Turkey and on headscarf bans in those two countries. And I had looked at how activists fighting headscarf bans in France and Turkey were using national and international courts, but also were using the UN. And I remember at the time a Turkish feminist Islamic NGO that was working at the UN and had just come back from Geneva and lobbying the CEDAW committee, telling me that it was the first time, and they were doing that in the mid-2000s, that it was the first time that the issue of headscarf ban had been picked up by UN member states and UN experts. And they were telling me, and they were really happy about that. Their objective was not to change the laws in Turkey. They wanted to create an international conversation on headscarf bans in Turkey. And they were telling me, it's normal that it's the first time that it's picked up. Because until the mid-2000s, NGOs that were lobbying on behalf of Turkey, especially feminist NGOs, were secular NGOs. So headscarf bans was not an issue of concern for them. So that's why it wasn't on the agenda. So I thought this was interesting because it speaks to who is able to be at the UN. In the case of these feminist Islamic NGOs, one of the reasons they were able to be at the UN was related to the rise of the Islamic bourgeoisie in Turkey. So they had the means, they were speaking English, and they had the means to travel and come to the UN. So it speaks to who is able to be at the UN. and how UN language, debates, and right crafting is also influenced by actors, not only member states, not only UN experts, but also civil society that has access to this forum. So I thought this was interesting, and I wanted to learn more about that. So it stayed with me. The other reason why I embarked that informs this project is related to a previous life of mine. So in a previous life, I worked for a Canadian NGO that was opening an office to work with the Human Rights Council. And this was around 2006, 2007. And I was surprised at that time already. I remember being surprised at that time I was surprised about the presence of faith-based NGOs at the Human Rights Council. And I remember seeing nuns with their habits in the Palais des Nations and wondering, what are these nuns doing in the Palais des Nations? For me, at that time, it appeared it was a dissonance. I'm like, the Palais des Nations nuns, what are they doing here? And so I thought, we need to explore this further. So these were sort of the genesis related to my that led me to think about this question. Of course, when you're when you work on a project, you might have you might think about a question, but then you start reading the literature if you're a scholar, and you try to see, who has done what and what has been written on this topic. So I started reading on faith-based NGOs in multilateralism, and I realized that there was quite a bit of work in international development studies on this topic. There was also work on humanitarianism and the work of faith-based NGOs. There was work in political science as well that was looking at NGOs with consultative status at the UN. Most of this work has been interested in sort of doing a lay of the land of who these groups are, so counting the number of faith-based NGOs if you want, and also assessing the beliefs of these NGOs. So classifying them, if you want, as liberal or conservative. So basically what this literature does is that it looks, it starts with the idea that religion and human rights are very different ethical realms. And then they try to assess the position of faith-based NGOs. So, for instance, if you're pro-life, you're considered liberal, and if you're pro-choice, then you're considered liberal. So it's an interesting literature. It gives you a sense of who these actors are. It gives you a sense of what type of issues they might be working on. But there's actually very little work on the human rights practice of these NGOs. And by human rights practice, I mean, what type of activities are they doing? So what type of lobbying are they doing? Are they doing other activities than lobbying? Who are they lobbying with? And how is their lobbying informed by their spiritual worldview? There's also very little literature on the other issues these NGOs might be working on. So you expect that they might be working on gender questions, on religious freedom issues, or interfaith dialogue, but they might be working on other issues. And there was not that much work done on that. So I thought, I wanted to explore this further. At the time, I was reading a lot of work in socio-legal field, especially by Sally Engel-Mary and others that invite us to look at human rights as socially constructed. So that human rights are constructed by the actors that inform that discussion. So they invite us to think of human rights in that way. And they also invite us to think about the practice of human rights and everyday practice of human rights of civil society. So I was informed, so my thought process was also informed by that literature. So that led me to the questions you have on the slide that are the guiding questions of the book. So why are faith-based NGOs present at the Human Rights Council? Why are they? Why are there nuns at the Human Rights Council? What are they doing there? And then what are their human rights practice? So how do they work? So these are the questions that drive the book and the discussion. And just to give you a sense, a little bit of who these actors are before I go into the methods and the findings of the book. So I think it's really important for you to know that when I started the project, my focus or my interest was on faith-based NGOs generally. I thought, okay, I'm going to look and go and see faith-based NGOs. But as I started doing fieldwork, I realized that Christian NGOs were the actors that were the most present at the Human Rights Council and the most active. That's not to say that you don't have other groups. For instance, the Baha'is have been at the UN since almost the inception of the UN. So there's other groups, but there's there's a presence of Christian NGOs. And this is actually reflected by the literature. So remember the literature in political science that I mentioned a while ago? Well, Carratenal are some of those researchers at this research, and they counted the number of faith-based NGOs at the UN with consultative status, they end up saying that out of 239 NGOs with consultative status at the UN, 70% are Christian. And out of these 70%, 47.62 are Catholic. So there's a dominance, which is interesting and I think is reflected at the Human Rights Council. So there's a dominance in terms of numbers, but also in terms of presence. And that I'll get back to that in a moment. But I think that's interesting. And by presence, I mean that a number of these NGOs have offices in Geneva. And that means that they're able to lobby member states, network, and do meetings throughout the year. They're not only coming in for the Human Rights Council sessions, that has 3 sessions a year. They are not flying in and flying out, but they have a presence in Geneva. And that affects the practice of work and the quality of work. And I'll speak to that in a second after when I share my findings. And I'm happy to share also some of the reasons why I think there's this dominance of Christian NGOs. Okay, so in terms of methods, so this is a mixed methods project. When I started the project, I thought I would do only interviews with faith-based NGOs in Geneva, but I quickly realized that if you're interested in the practice of work of faith-based NGOs, you actually need to do a mixed method. And my field site is the Human Rights Council. So here you see the session of the Human Rights Council, and just for those that are not aware, the Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year, and at least 3 times a year, and member states discuss human rights, pass resolutions on human rights issues, and experts produce reports on human rights questions there. In many ways, it's a political forum where human rights are being discussed, their boundaries are being defined and crafted. What's interesting about this forum is that it gives space for NGOs to participate with consultative status. So NGOs can assist the Human Rights Council sessions, so they can listen to those sessions, they can make short oral statements. But the other thing they can do is they can organize parallel events or side events, where they parallel events to the Human Rights Council sessions, where they discuss issues that are important to them, and they also invite. Sometimes these parallel events are co-sponsored by member states or with other experts. So these parallel events are really interesting because you get to see their practice of work in action. The Human Rights Council takes place in the Palais des Nations. I'm sure you're all familiar with, well, maybe not, but you must be familiar with the Palais des Nations that's next door. So it's this Art Deco building, and it provides, I think, a lot of space for people to network and speak. So here you have pictures of the Palais des Nations, the pictures where you have the chairs and the table. This is the Serpentine Bar with a lot of people, where people meet, delegates meet with NGOs, they speak. So the space is in a way is conducive for this lobbying. Carratenal in their book describe the space in New York, and they say the space in New York is not as conducive. So there's a question of spatial politics here that is really interesting, and I hope I capture that a little bit in the book. So basically, what I did is I did participant observation at the Human Rights Council during the June session from 2016 to 2019. So this means attending the sessions of the Human Rights Council that take place in room 20. You can see here, that's the map. But it also means attending parallel events. And these parallel events take place in all the other small rooms that you can see. So it meant, observing these parallel events and seeing what was going on in these parallel events. And this was really interesting. I also did interviews and had discussions with NGO representatives. And when I was having these discussions, I realized that one thing that a lot of faith-based NGOs I met were doing is they were training members of their congregations or members of, or church leaders at the grassroots level or members of their network that were not based in Geneva, but they were training them in human rights and in how to engage with human rights. Because most of the time, they rely on the information from the grassroots for their lobbying at the UN. So they need to train them in human rights. So I also ended up observing trainings, and this was a really interesting experience. Finally, because it's one of the objectives of the project was to document the ways in which these NGOs can participate in crafting human rights and how this may be informed by their worldview, I conducted archival work. And I did that mainly for the work of the Quaker United Nations office. So in the book, I tracked the evolution of their advocacy since the 1960s on the right to the objection of conscience to military service, and how they played actually a key role in ensuring that this right be protected. So that this right be understood as a right, and then this right be protected by Article 18 of the ICCPR. And archival work is actually really important to be able to track the practice of persistence, because it takes time for a right to get protected. So I'm very appreciative because I got access to those archives, and I'll just give you a little bit of a sense. When I arrived in these archives that are in the basement of the Quaker House, the archivist had just done boxes on the objection of conscience. So I think I was also extremely lucky, and they were very well organized, and they kept everything from the 1960s or 1950s until today. So this means memos that they had internal memos, correspondence with diplomats, correspondence with delegates, with experts. So this is really interesting for if you're interested in thinking about how human rights gets crafted. I'll speak more about that in a minute, but that's part of the method. So I think if you're interested in thinking about the practice of human rights, a mixed method approach that involves participant observation, interviews, archival, and document analysis is actually really important to get through that. And I mean, I think in the book I only get at the tip of the iceberg, but this is important. Okay, so now I'll turn to the findings and share a little bit what I found. So I think the first finding is the power of secular tropes, or the power of secularism, which means the power of understanding the UN as a secular space. And I'll read the quote from Father Gabriel because I think it says what I'm going to try to say in a much better way. So Father Gabriel here is training members of his congregation and his network on how to engage with the UN. So these members are not in Geneva, they're not in New York, but he's training them because he wants them to provide him information for his lobbying at the UN. And he says, there are two things you never do at the UN. You never tell a joke, and you never talk about religion. At the UN, if you try to tell a joke, it has to get translated into 6 languages. No one has time for that, so we don't tell jokes. And the second thing we don't do is we don't talk about religion, because religion is thought as a divisive topic and it creates difficulties. So here you go. You have a religious person that is training members of his congregations and members of his network that are religious on how to engage at the UN, telling them you don't talk about religion when you come in that forum. And so I think this is interesting and really speaks about the power of understanding the UN as a secular space. So in the book, I invite readers to think about what it means to understand the Human Rights Council the UN, and to a certain extent, human rights discourse as secular space and discourse. And I draw on my past work in critical secular studies, as well as on scholars like Elizabeth Shackman-Hurd and others that look at the relationship between the secular and the religious, and how secular discourses basically shape and influence what we consider to be religious. So this literature is different than a normative literature or a literature in political theory like Charles Taylor or Cécile Laborde. It does not seek to come up with a theoretical definition of the secular or what the secular ought to be, but rather it looks at the power of secular tropes. So the power of thinking that religion should not be at the UN, that religion and human rights are different frameworks, or the power that the idea that religion belongs in the private realm. So how do these tropes shape our understandings as scholars or as human rights experts, or even as actors engaged in human rights settings? How does it shape our understanding of what should be visible and what shouldn't? And so really the objective of the book is not to prove that the UN is or is not a secular space, but rather I'm really interested in thinking about the consequences of understanding the UN as a secular space. And so you can see it has consequences on the actors that interact in that space. There's other instances where I could see those consequences. So a number of the Catholic-inspired NGOs that I interviewed shared the thought process. They shared the thought process they had around representation. How should they present themselves at the UN? And so they had a lot of questions on what to wear. Should they be going to the UN and wearing their religious gear? Should they wear a veil if they're a sister, or their collar if they're a priest? Or should they not wear their religious gear? I mean, you're all aware, if you're wearing your religious gear, then you will be identified explicitly as a religious person. If you're not, you won't necessarily be, or not to the same extent. So some representative, like Sister Carmela that I met, explained how her and her congregation had made the choice that when they were at the UN, she would not wear her veil. She would wear it in Geneva, in her congregation, but she would not wear it at the UN. And one of the reasons for that was because her and her community thought that she would be better received if she would not be appeared as too religious, and they saw this as important to initiate and facilitate dialogue. Not emphasizing the religious dimension of one's identity also comes out in the choice of topic some NGOs decide to work on. So it's interesting because when I first went there, I was really expecting a number of these NGOs to be working on questions of gender and also questions around debates around the family. And actually some do, but a lot do not. And for some of them told me that they deliberately chose not to work on these questions at the Human Rights Council, either not so that they wouldn't make their religious position too visible, or also because they didn't want to create divisions within their community. So they worked on other issues that was as important, if not more for them. Issues around immigration, climate justice, poverty. But these issues are not necessarily perceived as religious as well. So it's interesting because, as you can see from Father Gabriel or from Sister Carmela's example, through their physical appearance, the discourse, the choice of issues you work on, some groups, some NGOs at least maintain the idea that the UN is a secular space and that religion is at best tangential to that space. So they maintain it and they reproduce it, and I think that's interesting. Some actors discussed in the book actually decide to blur these boundaries, and I document moments where they're blurring these boundaries. And they decide to draw on their religious identity to do that. There's different moments. I don't have time to speak about all of them, but I'll share one example from Father Michael. So Father Michael makes a very different choice than Sister Carmela. And when I meet him, he explains that his decision on what to wear was a big issue for him. So today, he wears his collar, but that wasn't what he initially did. When he first started, he started, like his predecessor, wearing a tie and a suit at the UN. He thought, this is how I should be dressing. But he started having questions. People were asking him, who are you? Are you religious? Are you a friar? Are you a priest? And he felt uncomfortable with these questions. And he decided that it would be important for him to be more clear about his identity. So he decided to wear his collar. And he told me in the interview, I hate collars, but I still wore it at the UN. And then he explains, and you can see it here, now people know who I am. Some people do feel freer to talk to me about things, and some people feel free to express their prejudice to me. Also, there are others who were surprised. What are you doing here? When I go to a side event talking about gay and lesbians, and I'm making comments about their rights. They're surprised. We can help deepen what's going on. And so that's really interesting here because he uses, in a sense, his collar, his embodied religiousness to question preconceived ideas and to try to build bridges. And that, I think, is important. But he is aware, like other NGOs that try to really bridge these different identities, they're aware that they can blur these moments, but they do that only when they feel that it will not affect their relationships and their alliances at the UN and the work they're doing. So it's deliberate, but it's really interesting, and you see these moments happening. Okay. So this is one of the first findings, I think, the power of secular tropes and what that does on representation and issues, and how that affects the work of some of these actors, at least. The other key finding that I wanted to share with you today is more about the blurring of these binaries. So while the UN is understood to be a secular space, it does not mean that faith-based representatives don't work in linking human rights and religion in their own engagement at the UN. In fact, this is essential for many of them to make sense of their place and their work in Geneva. So human rights work for a number of these religious representatives become about practicing their faith and practicing their faith well. And so that's, I think, an interesting thing to reflect on. So a number of Catholic representatives that are sent at the UN, and that's, I think, is really, for me, interesting. They're sent by their leadership, and they have little choice in the decision to come to Geneva. And a number of them actually do not know about human rights or are not really familiar with human rights. So not only do they have to start learning about human rights and learning about Geneva, the Human Rights Council, the language. I mean, for anyone that has worked at the UN, this is very complicated. So they have to start learning about that. But they also have to justify their presence in Geneva. And a number of these actors were actually working in the global south, doing missionary work, working on charity. And so to come to Geneva, it is complicated. How do you make sense of your work in Geneva when you've been working to alleviate poverty in the global south your whole life? How do you make sense of that? So it's a big learning curve. And here you have Sister Angela who says it's a big change from the shanty town to the diplomat's palace, speaking about Geneva. I don't have a background in international relations, so I had to study a lot. So not only did she have to study a lot about human rights, but she also had to study a lot to understand, she had to make the link between her religious mission, her understanding of her religious journey, and human rights. She had to formulate a link between how human rights lobbying is actually important to tackle structural issues that lead to poverty or climate injustice, for instance, and that were actually key to her religious work. And to make that link, some representatives shared how they had to reread the Bible and reread religious texts and encyclicals to see the emphasis on structural work and structural change. And when they were able to see that emphasis on structural change, they were able to link human rights to their religious journey. And then their presence in Geneva made sense for themselves first. They also had to make those links for members of their congregations that they were training. So remember, trainings are really important. And a number of NGOs, whether you're faith-based or not, do capacity building. That's really important of your networks. Because a lot of the time you rely on these networks to provide you information on human rights violations that you will then use in your lobbying at the Human Rights Council. Okay, but for religious NGOs and faith-based NGOs I interviewed, you also have to convince these church leaders or these congregation members of the importance of being engaged in human rights. And to do that, you need to link human rights with your spiritual or religious journey. And you need to make that link. And so in the trainings, a number of actors do make that link and invite their congregation members to reread the Bible and text to see the importance of structural work and to see human rights within those texts. And here you have Father Michael, who tells us about these trainings. And so he says, so we have to be on a mission, but they, and here he's speaking about members of his networks in local context, they find that in a very narrow sense. Now you're preaching, for the salvation of souls. And that's the big challenge for me, to show that you can't preach the good news to people without recognizing their fundamental dignity and that they need their rights fully articulated. I'm not trying to get people to change what they do, but look at what they do with new eyes. There's a long way to go, but at least there is more of a consciousness that justice and peace are integral to preaching. And so here, that for me is interesting because you see that he's really trying to show them that you need to think about structural concern and you need to think about human rights to be able to understand your religious mission differently. So there's entanglements here between human rights and religion. Actually, to justify your presence in Geneva, you need to really, in a way, understand human rights work as part and parcel of your spiritual journey. And these, I think, entanglements get overlooked if you only focus on the ways NGOs present themselves, if you only focus on whether they're using religious language or not in their lobbying. So they might not be openly speaking about the way their religious beliefs influence human rights, but to justify their presence in Geneva to themselves first, and then to members of their networks, they need to make their involvement in human rights part and parcel of their journey. So I think that for me was really interesting. Finally, the final finding I wanted to share with you was how sometimes this spiritual worldview does not only affect your understanding of why you are in Geneva and why you engage in human rights, but it also can affect methods of work, how you lobby, how you do lobbying. So there's many examples and a few examples in the book on that. I don't have the time to delve in those examples, but I'm going to share one. And this is visible in the work of CUNO, I think. So CUNO, for those that know, is the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva and has an office since the inception of the UN, and they were present before during the League of Nations. CUNO works on different issues, including the right to the objection of conscience to military service, which is directly related to a belief around the dignity of life and commitment to pacifism. So basically, supporting war means accepting killing, which is a direct violation of the idea that God is in everyone. Okay, so they have this strong belief. But what I think is interesting is they have this strong belief in the importance of pacifism and objections of conscience, but their human rights work and their advocacy to ensure that this right becomes embedded in human rights is part of their religious practice, and is related to how they practice and live their faith. So it's not only about belief, but it's also about action and about ensuring that this belief gets protected. And the action of ensuring that it gets protected is part of their practice of work, or the religious practice. And so you see it here, this is a quote from their website, where they say, Quaker UN work strives to be an outward expression of these values: peace, justice, equality, and simplicity. Living faith through action rather than words. And I thought that's telling. It's this idea of action. This also, in some ways, influenced their working methods. So if you're familiar with the work of CUNO, you'll know they organize traditional events. So they'll do parallel events at the Human Rights Council. They'll work on joint statements with other NGOs. They'll make oral intervention at the Human Rights Council. So very traditional activities. They do other types of activities as well, and they're known for that. They organize more informal activities, and they organize them in their Quaker house. So the Quaker house is in the Petit Saconnet, and it's, as you can see, it looks like a family house. And that's one of the objectives, is that they want people to come in that space when they're doing events and feel the informality and feel at home. And this is also related to one of their beliefs, and I'll read the quote from Rachel Brett here. But Rachel Brett, to give you a little bit of context, is a former representative of CUNO. She used to be very active at the UN. If you're familiar with the Human Rights Council, you probably have seen her. You know what she looks like. And so she wrote a fantastic book. There's the reference at the end of this presentation, if you're interested, about her work at the UN and about what she did and how she did it and how she did it differently. And that's influenced by her belief as a Quaker. And so she says in her book, if you believe that there is something of God in everyone, then this applies to government representatives. This has various consequences. The government ceases to be perceived as a single monolithic inhuman entity. And so this, in a way, shapes the way they approach diplomats and delegates. When people come in the Quaker house, they're approached as individuals. And the methods of work are done so that they shed away their diplomatic mask, or the fact that they're state representatives, and that they're more themselves. And with the hope that it will create informal dialogue, that it will facilitate people connecting to one another, and that it will also, that new ideas might emerge that have not been heard before. So the Quaker house that you just saw I'll just maybe show it again, plays a big role in that. And in her book, Brett says about a delegate that came in that house for the second time. She discusses this. And I just want to read the quote because I think it summarizes what I've tried to tell you. So she speaks about the delegate, and she says, arriving for the second time, he, the delegate, automatically, and he was coming in for a meeting to discuss a human rights question, he automatically took off his jacket and tie, and then hastily checked that this was all right, commenting that it felt like the home of his Lutheran grandfather. And here you go. So the idea is that he is taking off, his gear, basically his tie, his suit that makes him a diplomat, and he comes in that house and he is himself, an individual, this person. And it's the idea of being able to interact with the human, basically. They do also organize a lot of informal lunches with delegates. And again here, the idea of these informal lunches is not to get to find a resolution to an issue, but to initiate this dialogue. And there's a lot of discussion and thought process around the food that is being served at these events. I can speak about that if you're interested afterwards. But in her book, Brett says, there's a real sense of achievement when a participant feels at home enough to start with dessert rather than the main course. So again here, they want delegates to feel at home. So this is interesting because you can see how their methods of work in a way is also informed by their worldview. And I think you don't see that if you don't start looking at the practice of work. Finally, the final practice I want to speak about, and then I'll wrap up, is also central to the Quakers. I think it's central to the work of many others, but I'll speak about the CUNO here, is the work of persistence. So it's this commitment to duration and to patience. And I think this is important for an issue to end up being protected by human rights. And Brett says in her book, one of the hallmarks of CUNO is the willingness to commit for the duration. This is one of the significant differences between CUNO and others. This requires certain skills and character traits, but also supportive environments from the Quaker UN committees in particular, but also from Quakers more generally. And this is, I think, important because it shows that in some cases at least, they're not as dependent on short-term funding. So they have the more of a luxury. Not always, funding is always an issue, but they have a little bit more of a luxury of time, at least in the case of CUNO, to work on an issue. And this explains why they were able to work on the objection of conscience for 50 years. And in the archive, you really see the tedious work of persistence that is required for an issue like the objection of conscience to be protected. So it requires approaching different delegates, knowing who is in Geneva and who is leaving. It requires building and rebuilding alliances depending on the geopolitical climate. The objection of conscience was a wedge issue during the Cold War, so you had to really navigate around that. It also requires knowing when to lobby for a procedural resolution or a substantive resolution, with the idea that you always want to keep the issue on the agenda. And it also requires knowing when to go to the Human Rights Commission or Human Rights Council, or using a more legal route like the Human Rights Committee. But to be able to do that work, it takes time, it's tedious, and you need that type of luxury of time. So the sense of time is also different, and it's partly influenced because their funding, in part, they can rely on Quakers more generally. So I think this is also an interesting practice of work that I wanted to draw your attention to. Okay, so I'm almost done. Some of the key takeaways. I think one of the central key takeaway from the book is the implication of understanding the UN as a secular space. So as I tried to show, it has implication for us as scholars, first of all, what we see and what we don't see, if we think of the UN as a secular space. It also has implication for the work of actors and how they present themselves at the UN, and what is visible and invisible. But if we look for religion, quote unquote, in the discourse and how actors present themselves or on their position on particular issues, we'll see religion in a certain way, or maybe it will be visible or invisible. But if we change our outlook and start thinking about why actors are there in the first place, how they make sense of their presence in relation to their religious commitment, as well as whether their methods of work might be influenced by their religious worldview or their spiritual worldview, we're going to start to see more entanglements. And for me, these entanglements are important and are interesting to think about. The second implication, I think, is the dominance of Christian actors. And here I would really not want you to leave this talk with the idea that Christian actors are a black box. Christian and faith-based NGOs are very diverse. You have liberal NGOs, some that are more socially inclined, conservative, from different faith, different backgrounds. So it's not a black box. But they are, as I showed at the beginning, tend to be more numerous. But I think also the fact that a number of them have a presence in Geneva makes a big difference. So if you take, for instance, I'll go back to CUNO, but if you take for CUNO, who has a permanent office in Geneva since the late 1940s, they have been approached by member states to help them draft resolutions on questions. They hold informal meetings with member states and human rights experts because they have this presence and they're known to work on these issues of peace and other issues. And they also advise on strategies. So the fact that you have a permanent presence brings a quality to your presence and shapes the way you'll approach advocacy. It's different than if you're flying in and flying out for the Human Rights Council sessions. Then you don't have that type of luxury or privilege. So I think it's important to reflect on the consequence of that presence and on the consequence of that presence for right craftings and what type of rights gets protected and what types of rights might not get protected. Ultimately, I think it can also help us think about ways of making human rights crafting perhaps more inclusive. And here, it could open the door to other projects that would look at non-Christian faith-based NGOs and try to understand why, like their challenge of engaging being at the UN and what challenges they face. So I think this is interesting work for the future. I want to leave you with maybe two possible interesting work for the future, thinking about how this research could lead to other projects. One thing for me that I really discovered while doing this work is the importance of archival research. And this is valid for the work of faith-based NGOs, but I would say for all NGOs. I mean, when you think about human rights, and if you want to tell the story of human rights, that story tends to often be told from the perspective of member states, of UN experts, but it's not necessarily always told, or rarely told at least, from the perspective of NGOs. And here in the archives, you really see that some of them are essential to the crafting of human rights and of what types of human rights get protected. And so I think being able to do more archival work and get access to these stories is actually really important. The other thing is also, I think that we need to be cognizant on who participates and which groups participate at the Human Rights Council or at the UN more generally, and how that who changes in function of geopolitical climates. So as you saw from the example when I started my talk about the Turkish NGOs, the political climate in Turkey explained in part why they were present at the UN. And this geopolitical climate also influences what types of rights get traction and what types of rights don't. So currently, for instance, we see efforts by conservative Christian NGOs and member states to open the idea of the objection of conscience beyond military service to institutions like hospitals and pharmacies. And when I was starting my fieldwork, I was already seeing some of these NGOs organizing parallel events on that. And from conversation with colleagues, I think this is also taking place in New York. And New York is a very different scene than Geneva, but it's also taking place there. So, and I did a pilot project where I looked at one of these NGOs in particular, and I was able to track how they were systematically trying to open this right of objection of conscience in shadow reports that they were submitting at the UN. So I think this is important to keep in mind, especially in the climate we're in today. And it will also help us understand how ideas and concepts, including widening the objection of conscience, make their way into international discourse and international law. Ultimately, I think this is important because, as we all know, which human rights get recognized and protected has consequences on the life of individuals and society. So I think this is actually really important. Okay, so I'll leave you there, but before I'm finished, I also wanted to send my gratitude and thank not only you and the audience for listening to me, but also for all the folks that participated in this research and made this research possible. Without them, this research would not have been possible. So thank you very much. And I'll take questions.
Merci beaucoup de cette très belle conférence. Oui, allez vous reposer un petit peu.
Je m'assois ici. Et je peux prendre les questions en français ou en anglais.
D'accord. Préférez-vous les prendre une par une ou par lot de trois, si je puis dire?
On peut voir combien il y en a, et puis...
Qui souhaite peut-être... Qui souhaite commencer, madame? Théo.
Okay. Merci, I'm the first one. Thank you very much for a very lively. Thank you for a lovely presentation. Indeed, this is very interesting. This very interesting and less researched topic. The Christian NGOs at the UN and especially the Human Rights Council, right? And so my question is, who are these Christian actors? You mentioned a lot about the Quakers, but what about the other actors? I'm curious. And what about their topics of interest? Okay, so what is their deal here? Of course, they're not only functioning at the Human Rights Council, they're also working together with the UNHCR, etc. But focusing on your research, what are their topics of interest? And since also, another question is, since it's qualitative research, right, methodology, I would like to ask a question about your, identity as a researcher, or self-reflexivity, for example. And maybe the fourth question, which you mentioned at the very last, the Turkish NGOs working on the objection of conscience. What? No. I didn't understand that part, so if you can clarify. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll answer this maybe to start, and then I'll move on to the other questions. So the actors, there's a number of actors that I met. I mean, the Quakers are one I mentioned, but there's also a number of congregations of Franciscans, Dominicans, Salesian nuns. There's people from the World Council of Churches. So there's a variety of actors that I met and did research with. Their topic of interest, I tried to mention them. It's not, I was focusing more on the practice of work, but their topic of interest, I think, is a really interesting question. Because as I mentioned earlier, when I started this project, I really thought that I would be seeing NGOs mainly working on questions that we would think they would be working on. So questions around gender, the family, or questions around religious freedom or interfaith dialogue, no. But as I was doing research, I realized that actually most of them, or a number of them at least, worked on other questions, like climate justice was a really big one, business and human rights as well, immigration, poverty, and solidarity. So these were really important issues that were taking the front stage in the work more than gender questions. But I have to say that this project is based on the Human Rights Council, and it's a very different space. I think I haven't done research at the UN in New York, but I think New York and the UN is different, and it's more influenced by US politics. Also, this research that I did fieldwork from 2016 to 2019. I have to say that the world has changed a lot since 2019, and so it is possible that the discussions and the actors that are present are different now, especially around questions of the gender ideology and questions like that. So it's a snapshot of that period. But yeah, so this is for the topics. For my positionality, yeah, thank you for the question. So I delve in it in the book quite a bit. So I consider myself non-religious, if that's but I had a Catholic upbringing, and I think that in a way that facilitated the connection with some actors, I have to say. The other thing is I worked at the Human Rights Council, so I worked for OHCHR when I was young, a long time ago, and then I worked for this Canadian NGO that was opening an office at the Human Rights Council. It was a secular NGO. But this really facilitated my access and my understanding of the space, I think. And I don't think I would not say really, it's a complex space. It's hard to understand everything and what's going on. But the fact that I had worked there, I knew the Palais des Nations. I knew where their meetings were taking place. I knew the space, and I also knew the language, because otherwise the learning curve is very, very steep. So I think for me that facilitated greatly, and that privilege facilitated that. I also speak multiple languages, and at the UN, as you can see, you cannot translate to joke in 6 languages, but speaking multiple languages help. Some of the sisters and nuns speak Italian between them. Part of the trainings were in Italian. So the fact that you can navigate languages was also helpful. And your final questions about Turkish activists. So Turkish activists have nothing to do with the objection of conscience, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that. I was just saying how the political climate, when I was doing that first research in Turkey, where you had a rise in the early 2000s of an Islamic bourgeoisie, had allowed actors, civil society actors, to be able to come to the UN because they had because to be able to fly in and fly out in Geneva, to speak English, to speak that language, you need to be part of a particular, to have certain privileges. And I was saying how the political climate today is also, geopolitical climate is also changing, and that affects the actors that are present at the Human Rights Council and in human rights. And when towards the tail end of my fieldwork, I was noticing the presence of more and more conservative Christian NGOs that were trying to take the notion of objection of consent that is protected by Article 18 around military service and open it to other issues like contraceptives or pharmacies that would object to delivering, for instance, contraceptions or to doing medical assisted dying because objection of conscience is protected. And so this also speaks to the fact that human rights, as we know, are fragile, no? And they also change and shift with time. So yeah. So anyways, yeah. I hope I've answered. You're welcome. Maybe I'll take more than one question then.
Hi, thank you so much, Amélie. Wonderful research, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself to 2. You talked about how, for many of these religious folks over there, justice and peace in terms of human rights became integral to their preaching. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you also found that for many of them, they reconceptualized human rights itself through their religious lens. And if, because human rights it's a deeply sort of critical field mm-hmm. that has been criticized from left, right, from mm-hmm. like everyone, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if by focusing on these religious faith-based NGOs, we're getting a different sort of critique of human rights from a religious perspective. Mm-hmm. Do they think that human rights, because it's so secularized, is limited in its own goals precisely because there's no God in it? Yeah. I think my second question was about Pope Francis and the late Pope Francis, and how important did you think his work and his sort of very vocal politics influenced Catholic NGOs in Geneva? Yeah, okay, thank you.
I think I'll answer this question because I'm going to forget the questions, and I want to answer it and do justice to what you're asking. Really good questions. Thank you so much for asking that. I think they're related. So I'll start with Pope Francis. From when I interviewed, and this is especially Catholic groups, but Pope Francis so there's a diversity of Catholic groups, but Pope Francis and his encyclicals played a big role. And I would have to say that Laudato Si, on the environment, was really important to shaping some of the works of these NGOs on climate justice. There's another encyclical that came in later on refugees and walls, and that also played quite a bit in their lobbying. So Pope Francis was, I think, a really important figure, as were I would say founders of these congregations. So the Franciscans, St. Francis, Salesians, like the founders of these different congregations, also played a role in how they were approaching human rights. Augustinians, same thing. So, but yes. Thank you for the question of Pope Francis. I can't speak too much on their work on climate justice, but that took a center stage when I was doing my work. And for your second questions, with regards to human rights, I have to say yes, in some cases, and in terms of climate justice and part as well, because a number of these groups, what they were doing is that they were taking Laudato Si, that's this encyclical on environment, and they were feeding it and how they would understand human rights and climate justice. So there was this, it was not only how they would make sense of human rights vis-a-vis their religion, but it's also, you're right, on how religion would then shape their understanding of human rights and how they would approach it. And then they would read human rights and encyclicals or other teachings hand in hand and see connections. And you see that. And this is ignored, or you don't see it if you only look at how people present themselves and the language they use, but these connections are present. So I found that fascinating. But I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. There's more work to be done. Yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah.
Just one major question. Most of the Catholic, are very conservative, and did you have any opportunity to talk to some Christians that are not conservatives? What do they think about,
Christians that are not?
Conservative Christians.
Conservative Christians.
Yes. So what was your take on the human rights issues? And my other question, you already answered it, where I took into her. So I know you're from Canada as well. Are you Quebecois?
Well, half of my identity is complex, but my mom is Quebecois. Yeah, my mom is from Quebec, yes.
Okay. I spent my summer there, so
okay.
I could hear some of the accent, the French accent.
Okay.
And your last name sounds Turkish?
No, my last name is Swiss. I come from Valais.
Okay.
Okay. So you'll know everything about me after this talk.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so that's basically it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I mean, as I mentioned, I spoke with a range of groups, and there are a lot of groups like the World Council of Churches, the Lutherans, that try to, through their advocacy and their training, debunk different ideas around for instance, the gender ideology movement, and they're really trying to debunk it. And it was really interesting. I assisted to one training where they were, in a way, rereading the Bible and text with a gender lens, and that was fascinating as well. So there is, depending on the issues they work on, you reread religious texts. So if you're interested in gender issues, you might reread it with a gender lens. If you're interested in climate issue, then you will reread text with the idea of climate issue in your head. And so that's really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Bonsoir. Merci Amélie, vraiment c'était magnifique, j'adore ce que tu fais. Donc c'est un plaisir de t'avoir à Genève. J'aurais mille et une choses à te demander évidemment, mais je vais essayer de faire court pour laisser aussi la place aux autres. Moi je me suis demandé, parce que au fond ce que tu écris fait écho à mes propres recherches, et tu parles d'un espace séculier pour l'ONU. Et dans mes recherches, je regarde plutôt au début de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, et là, on voit qu'il y a cette idée de foi dans les droits humains qui est bien présente et qui vraiment est un fil conducteur. Et je me demande s'il n'y a pas plutôt plutôt que de partir de cette opposition entre séculier et religieux, de se dire, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un glissement de l'objet de la foi? Parce que en plus quand tu regardes les discussions au début qui ont constitué la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, c'est passé à ça d'avoir un Dieu au début, hein. Donc voilà.
C'est une super question. Je suis vraiment contente que tu la poses. Parce qu'une chose que je suis intéressée, c'est justement, en partie, ça c'est dans mes recherches générales, c'est à réfléchir à l'invisibilité de la chrétienté. En fait. Comment la chrétienté devient, et certains concepts autour de la chrétienté deviennent invisibles. Et on voit ça un peu partout. Et tout à fait, je pense qu'il y a cette idée que l'ONU est séculaire, mais il y a certains aspects de de la religion qui sont présents dans cet espace, qui sont invisibles. Dans le livre, je commence avec la discussion d'un événement autour d'un prêtre, et maintenant j'ai oublié, enfin un prêtre franciscain, je pense, qui était très important pour la création des droits de l'homme. Mais il y a une statue de cette personne à New York. Et c'est vraiment intéressant parce que sur la statue, quand on regarde la pancarte, c'est pas écrit qu'il est un prêtre. C'est écrit qu'il est le fondateur des droits de l'homme, mais on n'écrit pas son identité religieuse. Et pour moi, ça parle de l'invisibilité des droits. Et il y a la couverture du livre qui est ici.
L'invisibilité de la religion.
L'invisibilité de la chrétienté, comment la chrétienté reste invisible. La couverture du livre ici était un peu pour montrer cette idée. C'est que ça, c'est les couleurs de l'ONU, et vous voyez, il y a une croix derrière. Mais l'idée, c'est que ça reste invisible, que c'est présent sans être invisible. Donc ça parle de ça, l'invisibilité de la chrétienté, en fait. L'autre chose, on va peut-être voir un glissement là-dessus, je sais pas, c'est possible, mais c'est autour des concepts autour de l'écologie, où il y a plusieurs groupes à qui je parlais utilisaient le terme integral ecology, et ça c'était des termes qui étaient utilisés dans Laudato Si, et je me demande si il va peut-être pas y avoir un glissement là-dessus autour, où ça va peut-être être inséré dans le discours des droits de l'homme, et on va peut-être oublier entre guillemets, mais on va rendre invisible l'origine chrétienne de ces mots-là. Donc c'est intéressant, et on voit ça, oui, c'est clair. Ouais.
Encore une petite question, si je peux me permettre. Par rapport aux droits reproductifs, ce que tu proposes, ta vision, elle repose sur les années de ta recherche, ou bien, ouais, parce que là, je me demande si comment. Ouais, c'est en train de changer, et puis c'était encore différent avant. Encore, je reprends avec mes sources.
Tout à fait. Donc c'est vraiment, moi ce que j'ai essayé de faire, c'est vraiment juste une recherche, à part pour les archives sur les Quakers, c'était vraiment une recherche entre 2016 et 2019. Donc c'est pas une recherche historique, et et donc ça change.
Ouais,
ça change. Et ça parle aussi de la construction des droits de l'homme qui change. C'est pas, ça dépend de votre approche des droits de l'homme. Mais moi, mon approche, c'est vraiment une approche que les droits sont construits et qui changent par rapport aux acteurs qui participent à ces conversations, et avec le temps et avec les dimensions géopolitiques. Et c'est ça que je voulais expliquer un peu à la fin. Donc, je pense que ça serait intéressant à la fin de mon terrain. Je voyais justement la présence d'ONG conservatrices chrétiennes qui s'alliaient justement avec différents États membres pour promouvoir d'autres questions. Donc ça change. Et donc voilà. Ouais.
Mais je pense qu'il y a quand même tout. Ça change, mais j'ai l'impression, avec ma perspective historique, ça change, mais c'est toujours, au fond, il y a une sorte de discours en conflit. Et ça, c'est persistant.
Il y a un discours en conflit. Il y a un discours en conflit aussi entre les ONG religieuses chrétiennes et aussi à l'intérieur même des ONG catholiques. Parce qu'on voit très bien que, et ça c'est reflété aussi au sein de l'Église catholique, c'est qu'il y en a qui sont plus pour justement les questions sociales et de justice sociale. Et puis là, c'était la question par rapport au pape Francis, exactement. Et puis ensuite, t'as les questions de genre et de reproduction. Il y a toujours une tension. Ouais, tout à fait.
Merci, très très fine.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup. C'était vraiment super intéressant, super bien présenté. Je suis totalement émue et époustouflée. Alors, je voulais parler de la présence des chrétiens à l'ONU. Premièrement, quand même, l'origine des droits de l'homme, c'est tout de même la foi chrétienne qui a été, disons, transmise aussi par les patriarches qui connaissaient bien les Grecs et les Romains. Donc, c'est la philosophie, tout qui est derrière. On ne peut pas non plus les clouer le bec en quelque sorte ou leur obliger de devenir invisibles juste parce qu'ils ont maintenu un peu plus conscient ce lien. Alors, la présence des chrétiens, ce n'est pas seulement dans les ONG, mais bien sûr, il y en a aussi beaucoup qui sont actifs dans les autres ONG et autres organes, institutions, qui, ensemble, forment la société civile qui essaye de promouvoir. Donc ça, c'est une chose. Puis la troisième, c'est j'étais quand même un peu frappée, et on en revient toujours comme s'il y avait un conflit entre la perception chrétienne des droits de l'homme et des autres. Mais des autres, c'est aussi très vaste. Et puis pourquoi on n'est pas obligé de dire que c'est Judith Butler qui vous inspire pour votre gender ideology, et qu'on doit dire que c'est Laudato Si qui vous meut dans votre... Et alors là, je trouve qu'il y a une sorte d'injustice, oui, que je trouve, soit tout le monde doit déclarer, c'est ça et ça et ça, mais qui peut, à partir de 60 ans, encore savoir ce qu'on a accumulé et assimilé dans cette machine intérieure? Donc, je pense qu'il y a le défi du politique qui envahit tout, qu'il est presque impossible de trouver encore une plateforme ou une base qui est partagée. Et à mon avis, la grande majorité de la population humaine est croyante. Je ne dis pas catholique ou je ne sais pas, mais croyante. Je suis anthropologue, je vois bien. Et je ne vois donc pas pourquoi on peut leur priver du droit de se sentir plus représentés par ceux qui ont cette façon de voir l'être humain que de ceux qui disent on est juste comme un animal habillé, quoi, avec un peu plus de capacité, mais déjà en train d'être dépassé par l'intelligence artificielle. Donc, il y a beaucoup de raisons pour lesquelles je ne suis moi-même pas du tout pape pour le pape. Ça ne m'a jamais frappé parce que je ne suis pas donnée pour l'idéologie ou idolâtrie, comme on dit. Mais je me suis dit, maintenant je comprends, parce qu'il semble être au-delà de tout ça, il veut la paix, la justice. Et il le représente tellement que les gens hurlent de joie de le voir et qu'ils se sentent bien, parce qu'ils ont l'impression qu'il est le seul de le dire comme ça. Donc, j'ai dû avouer, oui, il y a quelque chose, parfois ça fait sens. Donc, voilà que je voulais vous demander ou partager. Merci.
Merci beaucoup pour le commentaire. Je pense que, oui, ben en fait, c'est ça, c'est qu'on voit comment certaines institutions, enfin, on voit le pouvoir de comprendre certaines institutions comme séculaires. Et qu'est-ce que ça fait? Et on le voit dans cette institution-là, qui est l'ONU. Et du coup, les acteurs doivent vraiment naviguer cette institution-là, naviguer comment ils s'habillent, de quoi ils parlent et comment ils parlent. Et c'est intéressant parce qu'avec Laudato Si, alors ça va peut-être changer. C'est possible que ça change, parce que comme je disais, ça change. Mais avec Laudato Si, c'était un moment où ils parlaient de Laudato Si, et il y a plusieurs acteurs qui en fait parlaient de Laudato Si dans des événements parallèles. Et normalement, on parle très rarement d'encycliques dans les événements parallèles à l'ONU. C'est très rare. Mais là, il y a des acteurs qui parlaient de ça. Et c'était correct. Enfin, c'était vu comme pas un problème, en fait. Parce que Laudato Si était vu comme un texte que d'autres personnes pouvaient comprendre. Encore avec des références chrétiennes. Hein, donc, ça reste chrétien. Donc, c'est intéressant. C'est qu'est-ce qui peut être visible et qu'est-ce qui doit rester invisible et comment est-ce qu'on navigue cette visibilité et cette invisibilité dans un espace qui finalement est construit comme séculaire, mais qui bien sûr certains aspects de la chrétienté restent invisibles. Donc oui, c'est des bonnes réflexions, merci beaucoup.
Ouais. Mais peut-être la plus grande différence, c'est que quand j'ai commencé dans les droits de l'homme, ça s'appelait droits de l'homme, c'était justement les droits immuables. Maintenant, vous avez dit que ce sont des droits construits. Et c'est là où nous sommes arrivés à un point de grande difficulté, même pour la paix dans le monde.
Je pense que ça dépend des approches aussi. Je pense qu'il y a certaines personnes qui vont vraiment... Enfin, il y a des approches théoriques où ils vont voir les droits humains comme des droits immuables encore. Mais quand on regarde ce travail, on peut voir aussi comment ils changent et comment ça... Et justement, comment ils sont fragiles aussi. Et donc, ça va.
Hi, so thank you so much for your presentation. Just for context, I'm a PhD student here at the Institute. I'm almost finishing my PhD, but I'm so fascinated that our research is very, very similar, even though in very different areas. So I did serve the same path of archival research, ethnography, fieldwork, and interviews at the Human Rights Council, although my fieldwork started in 2021, so I guess just after you had ended. And I'm fascinated with how much the dynamics you observed and the findings that you had are very similar to mine, even though I look at queer and feminist groups and not at all faith-based groups. So I was wondering two questions. The first one is because you mentioned a lot, or everybody mentioned a lot the role of the Pope or the figure of the Pope. But I was wondering what is the relationship between those NGOs that you sort of talked to and did your fieldwork with the Holy See, and the Holy See as the member who is present at the council. And I know, and because you talked about how many of those actors would have sort of progressive views in terms of gender, or avoid talking about gender because they didn't want to get into those debates, but the Holy See had a very important role in crafting the idea of gender ideology. And as I was finishing, so I didn't observe as much in my fieldwork, but in the very end of my fieldwork, so at the end of last year, the Holy See became more active as an actor within the Human Rights Council, which was not before. I was wondering when you were doing your fieldwork if it was the same. And then the second question was the relationship between because as I understand it, I mean, I'm going to start reading your book when I leave the event here, but I understand that you looked more closely at the progressive serve groups. I was wondering how is their relationship in rapport with regard the conservative groups? How do they see? Because a lot of those conservative groups who are faith-based, some more openly faith-based, some others not as openly, but who are trying to mobilize precisely against some of the things that the groups you look at are put forward. So yeah, thank you so much. Really, really fascinating research.
Thank you for the question. I'd be really interested in actually reading your work. So the relationship with the Holy See, that's a really interesting question as well, and thanks for asking it. So I think there's a diversity of Catholic groups, and some have a relationship. I'm thinking of Caritas International, for instance. They have a close relationship with the Holy See, but you have others that actually don't necessarily have that much of a close relationship, and they try to not necessarily engage with the Holy See. So it really depends, and it speaks to the diversity. You had parallel events that were organized with the Holy See on some questions, for instance, opening the idea of objection of conscience. So I was seeing that towards the tail end, but I'd be interested in speaking to you to see how active they are. I didn't focus on the Holy See. My idea was more to focus on these NGOs, but I think there is a relationship, especially around some of these questions on the notion of the family, whether we speak of family or families, and the gender ideology discourse. So I didn't look as much at really conservative NGOs. I'm thinking here, for instance, at the Alliance for Democratic Freedom. They've been quite active, and they're quite active in aligning themselves with other groups. It was actually hard to even have meet with them. So that's partly one of the reasons. But I think it's important to track their work and to see what they're doing, because they're very well funded, and they don't only work at the UN, but they also work at the European Court of Human Rights and in other spaces in human rights. And at the UN, they systematically submit shadow reports to different mechanisms on the issues of gender ideology, the family, and objection of conscience, where they're trying to open it up. So I think there's much more work to be done on these groups as well. They're also some of these groups are also more active in New York. At least when I was doing it, New York seemed to be a different scene. I didn't have a chance to go to New York. It would be an interesting project. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So my question is, if the origin of human rights is from a patriarchal perspective and Christian perspective, when the faith-based organizations reread the Bible for that purpose, there cannot be any discrepancies between the two, right? The Bible and the human rights, because if the one originates from the other, and if there is none, then why do they need to read?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think, I think the origin in some ways is Christian for sure, but I think a lot of their work, especially congregation members I spoke to in the field, really focused on questions of charity, and they were reading the Bible with that angle. And so they needed to reread the Bible to see the importance of structural change, and they hadn't looked at that. And sometimes the origins, the fact that human rights are Christian is also becomes invisible or is forgotten. So they needed to do that rereading of religious texts with that perspective. So it's a good question. I think it's often forgotten, and the focus it has in the field tends to be on charity or on alleviating poverty, and then they need to now to have these members be engaged in human rights. They need to convince them of the importance of being engaged in that structural work that goes beyond day-to-day charity or day-to-day work, and they need to do that. And that's where they end up having to reread text to show the relevance and the importance of doing that. Yeah.
Can I add something? So I'm doing a PhD research as well. At the same time, a pastor as well. So I want to speak to what you just mentioned. You cannot love God and don't love your neighbor. You see. So, but unfortunately, most pastors and church leaders, they've focused on just one part of the Bible and have like blinders in them, not to really ready to understand it for what it's saying, but what they already have as a preconceived notion. And that's been the challenge, of the Christian dom today, So, I agree with you, being a true Christian is also equivalent to having human right, issue, valued. You see, so because that's the two greatest commandments, loving God and loving your neighbor. That's what God said. So I think that's it. And every individual having that insight and really caring about their neighbor and reading the Bible and understanding the Bible for what it says, not really what we thought it says,
No, and I mean, like any text, the Bible can be read from different angles. You can read it with a gender perspective. You can read it with a climate justice perspective. Like the UDA chart, you can also read these texts. So that's also, it speaks to that, what you were saying, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm from Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, the American home of the Quakers. I live near Pendle Hill, and I used to work for a faith-based organization at the Human Rights Council. And I have a question. Can you talk about the evolution that you have seen between more liberal Christian groups that continue to champion the work of the Human Rights Council, and then the more conservative groups that maybe have a certain eschatology concerning Israel, and then that role of discrediting the entire work of the or even legitimacy of the Human Rights Council? What does that evolution look like between the start of your research in 2016 and what have you seen to the present?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I really stopped fieldwork in 2019, so I that wasn't I didn't look into that, so I couldn't. But I think it's a good question, and I think it speaks to the fact that you can't, although this work is a snapshot, you really, if you want to understand how discourses changes, you really need to continue the work because it can change quite quickly, especially with geopolitics. I'm also going to go back to saying that I think the actors were different in Geneva than in New York, but it could be that they're not as different today. But I don't know because I haven't done that work. But it speaks to the importance of continuing because it discourses and issues changes with time. Yeah. So thanks for the question. Thank you.
Many thanks for your presentation. And at the outset, you explained also the demography of the religiously or faith-based organizations. in basically here and working in the UN. And I was wondering, because 70% Christian affiliation is obviously disproportionate to the religious affiliation overall. And you also mentioned the basically background and also the underrepresentation of other faiths in that sense. So I would be interested if you can explain a bit where it comes from and also what are the implications of this imbalance of representation. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. That's also a really good question. I think there's different reasons why the origins of first of all, the origins of the UN and the fact that Christian NGOs, and groups were involved in human rights, I think might explain partly that. The second, I think that I reflected on that, and there's other scholars that have also thought about that. And I'm here mainly speaking about Catholic groups, but I think the fact that Catholic groups, because the Catholic groups are a majority within the Christian groups. And I think one of the reasons is that the structure of Catholicism that's quite hierarchic might facilitate their presence and and the fact that they can have offices in Geneva, in the sense that when you are your leadership decides that you will open an office in Geneva and they'll invest resources in that. And so it's much more hierarchic than other religions that might be not as hierarchic. So I think that might play a role as well. And to be an NGO, because remember these groups also are NGOs. To be an NGO, you need to be also structured in a hierarchic fashion in some ways. You need to produce, you need to be organized. And so maybe the organization of Catholicism facilitates that. I also think that there were efforts by the Holy See and especially under Pope Francis to increase the presence of these NGOs. And so again, that speaks to the hierarchical structure of Christianity. The impacts of that, for me, are important because as you saw from the example of the Turkish NGO at the beginning that is fighting headscarf bans, they're able to put this is an issue, this is an important human rights issue, they're able to put it on the agenda, but you have many other human rights issues that are important for different faith and that or groups or different groups and that might not get to the agenda because you don't have the privilege of having be a presence in Geneva, knowing member states, knowing who to speak to, people know. So all of that speaks also to the privilege that is related to human rights crafting and to the resources that you need. And I mean, resources are scarce for everyone, but there's also seems to be more resources for some NGOs than others, and it speaks to that. So this is an important question about making human rights more inclusive and more representative of society in general. Yeah, thanks for that.
Merci beaucoup pour votre conférence qui était passionnante. Moi, j'aurais une question sur ces 30% d'ONG qui ne sont pas chrétiennes,
Oui.
Sur leur action, sur un peu leur répartition, si vous avez pu faire des études dessus. Et puis une réponse spontanée à la question d'avant, où je pense que aussi, à la différence du catholicisme, même de la chrétienté, il y a des pays qui ont pour religion d'État l'islam. Donc ils n'ont peut-être pas une présence d'ONG, mais ils peuvent porter leurs valeurs et leur religion à travers l'action étatique. À l'inverse, le catholicisme n'est plus religion d'État, sauf pour le Vatican, et n'est pas porté officiellement, à part par ces ONG qui donc font ce rôle à la place de l'État. Donc est-ce qu'il y a une nécessité d'ONG islamiques et est-ce qu'il y a une nécessité d'ONG aussi hindoue, sachant que voilà, la diplomatie hindoue porte peut-être ses valeurs déjà en elle-même. Et voilà, quel est votre avis là-dessus?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Je vais peut-être répondre à la deuxième et puis après je vais à la première. Je pense qu'à mon avis, il y a quand même une nécessité parce qu'il y a une diversité dans ces religions. Et on le voit avec les ONG catholiques ou chrétiennes, elles sont très diverses. Et justement, autour, par exemple, de la question de genre, certaines vraiment vont combattre l'idée de gender ideology. Donc, il y a une diversité et on retrouve la même chose dans les groupes, dans les ONG d'autres confessions. Puis aussi, les enjeux sont différents par rapport à si vous êtes situé situé en France ou si vous êtes situé au Pakistan et ainsi de suite. Donc je pense qu'il y a une diversité et il y aurait lieu vraiment de développer cette diversité pour que les enjeux, pour que ces enjeux soient plus présents. Après, j'ai pas vraiment étudié, donc je me suis vraiment focalisée sur cette présence de la chrétienté. Donc j'ai pas étudié ces 30%. Il y a d'autres groupes, dont par exemple j'ai mentionné au début les Baha'is. Ce que j'avais trouvé aussi, c'est que il y avait beaucoup de groupes aussi qui finissaient par être assez nationaux, donc être des groupes qui allaient par exemple être les musulmans, enfin je vous donne un exemple fictif, mais ce serait les groupes musulmans de la Syrie ou une ONG par exemple, comme l'ancien, maintenant c'est plus le CCIF, mais c'était le CCIF avant, mais le Conseil, une ONG qui se focaliserait sur les enjeux des musulmans en France, par exemple. Ce sont des groupes beaucoup plus nationaux que transnationaux, alors que ces ONG chrétiennes ont quand même une dimension transnationale qui, à mon sens, est intéressante. Donc voilà, donc c'est ça. Donc, ouais, voilà.
Et donc, que les nations portent en elles-mêmes il y a une forme de théologie derrière leurs actions politiques, c'est ce que vous avez pu voir, on va dire, aussi dans vos études ou pas?
Non, j'ai pas regardé, je me suis vraiment focalisée sur les groupes de la société civile et pas sur les États. Une des raisons étant qu'il y a quand même de la recherche justement. Par exemple, je considérerais le travail de Jeffrey Haynes. Jeffrey Haynes, il a travaillé sur les États ou les organisations religieuses qui ne sont pas des ONG, en fait. Donc, il y avait déjà des travaux là-dessus. Oui, voilà.
Thank you very much. I came a bit late to this discussion. I wonder, as we see a deep crisis of values and global governance, including disillusionment with institutions like the UN system, what have you seen in your research? What have we learned, or what can inspire or repair, hopefully, the set of values, remember the values that we have in the system? What kind of examples that you see have inspired change in discourse and also change in actions? And what do you see? How could we further open up these conversations? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really big question. Thank you for the question. I don't know if I can answer it, but what I can say is that, I mean, and that comes back from the earlier researches that I did. I was always surprised that groups would be involved at the UN and at the Human Rights Council or Human Rights Committee initially, especially when I was looking at activists that were fighting headscarf bans, because I was surprised because decisions, even of the Human Rights Committee, they are binding, but they're not binding as they're soft. It's not like decisions of the European Court of Human Rights that have a binding aspect to it. So I was always surprised thinking about why are groups at the UN? I mean, if you're lobbying, but if the decisions are not binding, who is going to respect those decisions? Why are you there? But actually, the groups I spoke to had some hope in them, and I think that's interesting. And they were telling me, it's about putting the issue on the international agenda for it to be present. It might end up being protected, like the objection of conscience that ends up being protected and included, but maybe not necessary, might not. But it would be on the agenda, and people will speak about it, and it will be. And so, that was why it was important. So I think even if it's soft, even if it's not binding, there is some value to it because it's part of the conversation. And maybe the hope is that groups are still active and are still using the system. But otherwise, I know that the times we're in are not very hopeful. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
S'il n'y a pas de
dernière question. Je pense que il faut donner quelques répits à Amélie, qui commence à fatiguer. Merci de votre présence, merci surtout Amélie à vous-même pour cette très belle conférence et puis ce très bel échange également extrêmement nourri. Et je vous souhaite un excellent après-midi, peut-être à tout à l'heure pour la seconde conférence de la chérie Voltramar de la journée, et en tout cas un excellent week-end d'ascension. Merci beaucoup Amélie.
Merci.